Great. So I'm Jackie Klopp, and I'm part of the Digital Matatus project. I'm based here in New York at Columbia University. And I'm going to talk to you tonight about what I call popular transit and the role that tech can play in the future of this form of transit, which is the dominant form of public transit in most cities around the world. And it consists of these little minibuses, which we also have in New York, the dollar vans. Okay. And I know that we're at this really important historical moment where we have a serious climate change problem. So I do want to remind you that one of the big questions for these cities across the globe that are dependent on public transit, the majority of people use public transit, like in Nairobi, where 70% of the population uses public transit and a much smaller number uses a private vehicle. We have this question of, can these cities improve transit enough to retain their populations in public transit and avoid this kind of high carbon, low livability lock-in that actually we have in a lot of our cities? And sadly, what we're seeing is a lot of the investment is going into things that look like that, highways, but increasingly we're seeing investments in buses and trains. So that's positive, except there's a bit of a problem, and that is that there's not as much investment going into building up data as the critical infrastructure for us to move into a new kind of paradigm, which is based on superb information and all the kind of work that you transit techies are doing, which is this idea of mobility as a service, that nobody really needs to own a car in a dense city, that if you really need to, you can hail one, you can access one, but you'll see that it's always almost better to use a bike or public transit, and you have excellent information, exactly what you in this community are trying to build for users. So if we go to many cities in the world that are already using cell phones extensively, like Nairobi, and use public transit and actually walking and cycling, can we leap to this phase? Well, if we want to leap to this phase, then we're going to have to do the kind of work that you're doing here in New York in some of these other cities, and also support techies in these cities. So I'm going to talk to you very briefly about the Digital Matatus project, which is a collaboration between my center at Columbia University, MIT, the University of Nairobi, and a small design firm called GroupShot. And we got some initial support from the Rockefeller Foundation. And basically, we wanted to see if we could leverage cell phones, and pretty much everyone in Nairobi has a cell phone, to build open standardized data, GTFS data, for these minibuses, which we call Matatus. And now these are systems that have many features like bus systems, but they often are more flexible. And they have certain features. For example, along some roads, they might do drop-offs all along the road. There's a lot of, the fares can fluctuate. So there are features of these systems that are different from bus systems. And we had a theory of change. We figured if we could get the University of Nairobi students to ride these routes and collect information, the basic, geolocation of the stops, if we could create this data in a standardized format, the GTFS, which has its challenges, if we could make this open and if we could visualize it, perhaps we can really encourage improvements in these systems and also more innovation. And also, we don't want cities in other parts of the world not to have access to the kind of high quality transit data that we are trying to build in our cities. So we did have these University of Nairobi students map out the Matatus system for Nairobi. We were able to geolocate stops, name them, figure out whether they're designated or undesignated. It turns out 67% of the bus stops that are regular are informal. That means the minibus operators just know that this is where they do the planning basically for the city. They know this is where we need to pick up passengers. And we basically created a GTFS data set for Nairobi. But we also decided it was very important, because this is the public transit system for the city, to create a visualization of the Matatus system. So this is one of the first maps of a minibus system for an African city. And it was interesting because Jarrett Walker picked this up very quickly to do a bit of a network analysis. So once you start to be able to visualize the system, you can start to see that it has certain features that are problematic. So for example, everyone wants to be in the center of the city because that's where the most business is. This is very typical of private systems. It's the same with our taxis, our yellow taxis here in New York. They all want to be down on Wall Street, right? And then you have areas that are not served well. So you can start to say, wow, we can maybe think about the ways that we could fix the network of this system, perhaps by creating some subsidies and improving it. So you can start to do some real planning. So knowing to go from A to B also requires information, which I'm very puzzled that somehow many of the people working in transport in these cities don't seem to think that people in these cities need this information like we do. But what we're finding is that they want it. They're asking for it. We created a GTFS feed that was good enough to put on Google Maps to pass the validation process. We're in the process of updating it, and this data is being used. Right now, we get about 300,000 uses of it every week, which is still not so much, but it shows that there is a demand for it. So this is really important to us, and also to show that for one of these systems, even though it's challenging, you can create this kind of feed. And I think this raises the big policy question of, is the vision that we're going to replace these minibus systems? Or are we going to actually try to figure out how to engage them as the existing public transit system? The idea in a lot of people's heads that are putting investments into these cities is that we're just going to replace them with big buses. But that's been very difficult for many reasons to do. So what we're seeing is in some cities in Africa, for example, in eThekwini or Durban in South Africa, the cities are starting to say, look, we actually need to work with these minibus systems, do service contracts, but let's use technology. Let's put tracking devices on them and say, we will give you a service contract, but you have to speed less. We're going to act, or speed not at all, and we're going to track you. But then we're also going to start to get real-time information. We can start to create information systems for people. And this is building that data as an infrastructure for this other paradigm of mobility as a service that will allow these cities to hopefully not go through our history of building car-dependent, sprawled cities that are very polluted and problematic for that reason. So this is this program in South Africa that's starting. In Maputo, once we started doing this mapping, a whole bunch of techies and activists in different African cities started to do it as well. So in Maputo, there's a team that mapped out the little minibuses, chapa-chapas in their city, and created a map similar to ours, except they also included rail. They made a multimodal map, which was great. And a company created a screen and started to experiment with exactly what the company here tonight in this building is doing for New York, which is putting some advertising on the screen, but providing really important transit information for citizens. So we can see that this sort of thing is possible, and the data that we're getting from surveys and people in these cities is that they want this. They want their system to be legible. And so this is very, very important. But there are challenges because many of these cities don't even have transit authorities. Who's going to be collecting this data? Right now in a number of cities, it's groups like you, it's transit techies and public transport advocates. Like our project is creating this data and updating it for Nairobi. So that's not really a great system. The other thing is, for now, we're trying to figure out how we would transfer this to a more institutionalized setting. Although we do work with we have the University of Nairobi as our core partner, so we have this whole steady stream of techies who are constantly helping us, who are committed to improved public transit. But we need better tools. That's why I'm talking to you tonight. We need better editing tools to be able to do the updating in a much better way, incorporate feedback and crowdsourcing. We came up with some similar challenges actually from what I heard with Francis's talk about using OpenStreetMap as a base and trying to, edit GTFS on that. So I think we have some things we can talk about together here. And the other thing that I think I would love to have the support of techies everywhere is the need to rethink the GTFS standard. And here I'm just talking about the static data for now. And it's not a perfect standard, it's powerful in its own way. But if we want to start to incorporate these kinds of modes of transit, like these little minibuses that have certain features, like the more flexible ways that they pick up passengers, skip stops, have non-fixed schedules, for example. We need to work on the GTFS standard. And there is an effort right now out of the Rocky Mountain Institute. There's an organization called mobilitydata.org. There's a group of techies working on 3 problems: dealing with fares, which can be a real problem; accessibility in the sense of people with disabilities, knowing really, and this is a big issue for us in New York, knowing really that a station is properly accessible to them, that there is a functioning elevator, and that even if you use that elevator, you can still navigate. So that's one of their challenges. And then the other, which is really relevant to the rest of the world, including these places with minibuses, is how to deal with this kind of more on-demand transit, or mobility, I should say, which is what we're starting to see also in our cities. And actually, I think that's really interesting that we have dollar vans here, we have companies like Via. Increasingly, there's these companies in Europe as well doing more of these almost Matatu-like services, but with ride-hailing and minibuses. How do we incorporate those kinds of mobility services into GTFS? And we don't have the answer yet, so that's why I'm throwing this out to you as a challenge, that we need to be able to figure this out. I just want to say, for these cities in Africa and also more recently in Latin America, I've got to talk to Francis about joining the Latin America network. We are trying to create resource centers, or places where people can share the open source tools, the GTFS feeds. We're encouraging anyone who becomes part of these initiatives to make their data open, because that is a really big problem across the globe. So someone may create a GTFS feed, but it's not open. We can't improve it. We can't test it. And so this is an ongoing initiative to help these cities where they don't have the city capacity or the transport authority to do this, because we cannot lose that opportunity for the kind of emerging of these more public transit oriented cities based on data as infrastructure. And we'll lose it if we don't really do this kind of thing. So, and by the way, we're also creating some of these tools within the project, and we're also trying to collect service information as well, which I think is very relevant for here, that we should be collecting more of how passengers really experience their service. so that we can talk about improving it. So I will end there and take any questions that you may have about this kind of work.